Richard Davenport wasn't the kind of man who asked. He took. At 38, he commanded a real estate empire from his Manhattan penthouse, a skyscraper of glass and steel that was practically an offense to the gods. Every window in that place screamed, "Power," and his every order was carried out before he even finished the sentence. To Richard, the world was a chessboard, and people were mere pieces to be moved according to his will. He was engaged to a woman who seemed to have been sculpted from marble, spoke 3 languages, and whose last name was worth as much as his. It was an agreement, a business deal, like everything in his life. What he never imagined was that the most insignificant piece on his board, the one he barely saw, was about to deliver the most devastating checkmate of his life. Isabella Martinez, 25, lived behind the scenes of this empire. She was the maid, the shadow who cleaned the crystal glasses from which Richard drank exorbitant wines and made the bed where he hardly slept. Coming from a humble family in Queens, she sent half of her salary to help her parents and dreamed in silence of one day opening her own small cafe. She knew Richard better than anyone. She knew he hated the smell of lavender, that he took his coffee as bitter as his own soul, and that, behind the armor of coldness, there was a loneliness that echoed through the empty corridors of that luxurious penthouse. Isabella was invisible to him, an anonymous face in his calculated routine, but she saw the truth behind the tycoon, and it was this perception that would make her so dangerous to him. Everything changed on a stormy night. Not just any storm, but the kind that brings New York to a standstill, with lightning tearing across the sky and a deluge that seemed to want to wash away the city's sins. Richard had just lost $1 billion deal. A betrayal by his most trusted partner left him wounded, furious. For the first time in years, the mask of absolute control fell. He dismissed his driver. His fiancée wasn't answering her phone, and upon arriving home, he found only silence and Isabella, who was preparing to leave. He asked her to stay to pour him a whiskey, and then another, and another. That night he didn't see the maid. He saw a woman with kind eyes who didn't judge him, who listened in silence as he, drunk and vulnerable, confessed his weaknesses. The storm outside was a mirror of the one happening inside them, and in that vulnerability, in that chaos, they crossed a line that could never be erased. The next morning was cold and brutal. The sun invaded the penthouse like a silent witness to what had happened. Richard woke up first, and regret hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about the act itself, but about the loss of control. He looked at Isabella, sleeping serenely, and what he saw was not a woman, but a mistake that needed to be fixed, erased. He left a pile of money on the nightstand, an amount that was pocket change to him, but represented months of hard work for her. He left before she woke up without a word, believing the money would speak for him, that the problem was solved. He couldn't have been more wrong. 6 weeks later, as he struggled to close the wounds of his empire and his pride, Isabella stared at 2 blue lines on a pharmacy test, and her world and his stopped spinning. She was expecting a child, the heir the tycoon would never admit to having. The 6 weeks following that stormy night were a blur of denial for Isabella. She convinced herself that the fatigue was from overwork, that the nausea was from something she ate, but deep down, in a quiet, terrified place in her soul, she knew. The truth came in the form of 2 blue lines, sharp and unmistakable, in the tiny bathroom of her Queens apartment. The world stopped. The sound of cars on the street, the distant siren, everything disappeared. There was only the sound of her heart beating wildly against her ribs. Pregnant, a word that was both a death sentence and a miraculous promise of life. Panic suffocated her, cold and paralyzing. How could she do this alone? With what money? What future could she offer a child? But then, instinctively, her hand rested on her belly, and amidst the chaos and fear, a protective wave of warmth washed over her. It wasn't a problem. It was a life, a part of her, and whether he wanted it or not, a part of him too. She spent days in agony, rehearsing conversations in the mirror that always ended in disaster. One part of her, the more naive part, clung to the memory of that vulnerable man in the dim light of the penthouse, the man who confessed his fears to the sound of the rain. Maybe, just maybe, that man was still there, buried under layers of arrogance and expensive suits. The other part, the realistic one, knew the Richard Davenport the world saw. The ruthless shark, the fiancé of an heiress, the man who tolerated no complications in his perfectly orchestrated life. She knew that seeking him out was like willingly walking into a lion's cage, but every time she felt the morning sickness or thought about the future, the answer was the same. The child deserved to know, and she, as terrified as she was, needed to give Richard the chance to be a father. With her heart in her throat and a determination she didn't know she possessed, she decided to confront him. Getting an audience with Richard was impossible. He had avoided her in the penthouse since that night, and the security guards at Davenport Tower were trained to bar anyone who didn't belong in that universe of wealth. Isabella's only chance was an ambush. She found out what time he arrived, and for 3 mornings in a row waited on the cold Wall Street sidewalk, feeling small and invisible amidst the sea of rushing executives. On the 3rd morning, she saw him. He stepped out of his black Maybach, impeccable in a grey suit worth more than everything she owned. "Richard," she called, her voice almost lost in the wind. He turned, and for a second his eyes showed a flash of recognition, immediately followed by an icy irritation. He walked over to her, his jaw clenched. "What do you want, Martinez? If this is about a raise, speak to HR," he said, his voice low and cutting, without even giving her the dignity of a direct look. It was there, in the middle of the busy sidewalk, with the world passing them by, that Isabella gathered all her courage. "It's not about that, Richard. I'm pregnant, and the child is yours." The words hung in the cold New York air, more shocking than any thunderclap. Richard's face shifted from irritation to disbelief, and finally to a contained, terrifying fury. A scornful smile formed on his lips. "You have to be kidding me," he sneered, bringing his face close to hers. "Let me guess. You thought one drunken night would get you the winning lottery ticket. Do you think I'm some kind of idiot? I know exactly what you are. A cheap opportunist trying to pull a scam on me." Every word was a knife, twisting in her chest. The hope she had carried, however small, died right there on that sidewalk. He had humiliated her, stripped her of her dignity, turning the most significant moment of her life into a dirty transaction. He saw her not as a person, but as a problem, a risk calculation that needed to be neutralized. If this story has touched you so far, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the twist that's coming. "How much?" he asked, his voice now devoid of any emotion, as if he were negotiating a stock on the market. "What's your price to disappear from my life and solve this?" He gestured vaguely toward her belly with disgust. The insult was so deep, so cruel, that Isabella's pain transformed into a cold, lucid anger. That man did not deserve to be a father, not to her child. He took out his phone and made a quick call to his lawyer. "Prepare a severance agreement for Ms. Martinez. Include a confidentiality clause and a generous compensation. 5 zeros should be enough to buy her silence." He hung up and stared at her, expecting her to cringe, to accept the crumbs from his fortune. To him, it was simple. Everything and everyone had a price, but Isabella didn't flinch. For the first time, she looked him directly in the eyes, and he saw no fear or tears. He saw a strength he didn't know she possessed. She shook her head slowly. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice steady, though her insides were trembling. "There isn't enough money in the world to buy my child. You can keep your deal, your silence, and your empty life." She turned, without looking back, leaving him standing on the sidewalk, momentarily shocked by her audacity. She didn't want a cent from him. She just wanted him to be a man, and he had failed spectacularly. As she walked toward the subway station, the tears she had held back finally came, hot and silent. She wasn't crying for the man who had rejected her, but for the battle she knew was to come. That same afternoon, she received a formal email from the HR department of Richard's company. Her services were no longer required, effective immediately. She was unemployed, pregnant, and completely alone in the most relentless city in the world. With her hand on her belly again, she made a silent promise to her child. "It's just the 2 of us now," she whispered to the city's hustle, "and I swear I'll be enough." The war had been declared, and Isabella, the invisible maid, was about to show the tycoon the true meaning of the word value. The firing was just the first blow. The reality of New York for a pregnant, unemployed woman was a ravenous beast. Isabella's savings, which had seemed like a safety net, vanished with frightening speed. Rent, bills, food, every dollar was counted, every meal a strategic decision. The job search became a humiliating cycle. No one said it outright, but she saw it in the interviewer's eyes. Her belly, which was beginning to subtly show, was a liability, a future problem. She swallowed her pride and took a job at a diner in Brooklyn, a world light years away from the Manhattan penthouse. The smell of grease permeated her hair. Her hands became rough from scrubbing counters, and her feet ached in constant agony. But every exhausting shift, every $1 tip, was a small victory. It was money for prenatal care, for the first baby outfit she saw in a thrift store window and couldn't resist. Exhaustion was her constant companion, but the life growing inside her was the fuel that kept her from falling apart. It was at that diner that she met Maria, a Puerto Rican woman twice her age, with a heart the size of the world. Maria, who had already raised 3 children alone in the jungle of New York, saw the tired soul behind Isabella's forced smile. She became the family Isabella didn't have nearby. She brought hot soups on days when the nausea was unbearable, gave tips on how to relieve back pain, and most importantly, she listened. One quiet evening as they were cleaning the kitchen, Isabella broke down and told her everything. Maria didn't judge her. She just held her hand, her eyes filled with a protective fury. "Men like that," Maria said in a raspy voice, "they build castles of glass, but they forget that life always finds a stone to throw. Let him stay in his castle, my child. You are building a home, brick by brick, and that, not all his money can buy." Maria's words were an anchor, a reminder that she was not completely alone in this storm. While Isabella counted coins to take the subway, Richard Davenport's life was a succession of glamorous events and 8-figure transactions. He and his fiancée, Victoria, were the couple of the moment, gracing the covers of business magazines and society columns. They hosted a charity ball at his penthouse, where the champagne flowed like water, and conversations were about tax havens and hostile takeovers. At one point, Victoria, stunning in a silk gown, placed her hand on his arm. "Darling," she said with a calculated smile, "I was thinking, after the wedding we should start thinking about the heir, a Davenport Vanderbilt. Imagine the lineage. It would be the ultimate union of our dynasties." Richard smiled back, an automatic gesture. But the word heir sounded strange, hollow. He looked out through the panoramic windows at the city lights, and for a fleeting instant, the image of Isabella, with her frightened yet defiant eyes, flashed in his mind. He blinked, brushing the memory away like an annoying speck of dust, and turned his attention back to the cold sparkle of the diamonds on his fiancée's neck. Isabella's turning point came in a community clinic, with peeling walls and the smell of antiseptic. It was the day of her first ultrasound. Lying in that cold room alone, the fear returned with full force. What if something was wrong? What if she couldn't do it? The nurse, a kind woman, applied the cold gel to her belly and turned on the machine. And then a sound filled the room, a rhythmic, fast, strong sound, thump, 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 her baby's heart. Silent tears streamed down Isabella's face. The nurse turned the screen, and she saw it. A small, flickering shape, a promise of life pulsing in the darkness. In that instant, Richard Davenport, the firing, the diner, the loneliness, everything lost its importance. Nothing else mattered besides that sound, that image. That little life was real. It was hers, and she would move heaven and earth to protect it. She left the clinic with the ultrasound photo in her purse, feeling richer than any tycoon in his glass tower. She didn't have an empire, but she had a purpose. Richard, on the other hand, felt an emptiness that not even the most profitable deals could fill. He became more irritable, more ruthless. One day, his lawyer called. "Richard, just a follow-up. That severance package we prepared for Ms. Martinez, it was never touched. The check wasn't cashed, the documents weren't signed. Legally, it's as if we never made the offer." Richard was silent for a moment, an inexplicable rage rising in his throat. He had offered a solution, a clean, expensive way out. Her refusal was a challenge, an anomaly in his world where everything had a price. "Leave it," he growled into the phone. "She made her choice. It's not my problem anymore." But as he hung up, he found himself looking at the photo of his own father on his desk, a stern man who always spoke of legacy, blood, continuity. For the first time, Richard wondered what his father would say about a legacy he had refused to acknowledge. The seed of doubt, small and poisonous, had finally been planted. The months dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Isabella's belly grew, transforming into a map of her journey, a visible testament to her resilience. Working at the diner became an ordeal. Her ankles swelled, her back screamed in protest, and the exhaustion was so deep it felt like it was part of her bones. More than once, she had to run to the bathroom to cry in silence, not from sadness, but from sheer exhaustion. Still, she persisted. Every kick from the baby inside her was a reminder of why she fought. It was a secret conversation, a promise. In her tiny apartment, she set up a corner for him with second-hand items. A crib that creaked, a mobile of stars she painted herself. It wasn't much, but every object overflowed with love, a love that Richard Davenport, in his sterile penthouse, would never know. Richard, for his part, tried to fill the void with more work, more luxury, more power. He closed the biggest deal of his career, a merger that put him at the top of New York's real estate world. He bought a yacht, gave Victoria a diamond necklace that dazzled the press, but nothing worked. The memory of Isabella haunted him at the most unexpected moments. He saw her in the face of a woman on the street, heard her voice in a distant echo. Her refusal to accept his money gnawed at him. It was the only negotiation he had ever lost, the only problem he couldn't solve with a check. His fiancée, Victoria, began to notice his distance, his growing irritability. "You seem miles away, Richard," she commented one night during a tasteless dinner at a five-star restaurant. He just shrugged, blaming work stress. But the truth was that he was trapped, haunted by a woman who should have been forgotten, and by a child he refused to accept as his. On a Sunday afternoon, during a mandatory visit to his parents' mansion in Connecticut, fate planted the final seed. His mother, a steel matriarch with a critical eye, was flipping through an old family photo album. "Oh, look here, Richard," she said, pointing to a faded photo of a baby. "You, at just a few weeks old, so serious, as always. And look, here it is, the Davenport mark." She traced a spot on the photo with her finger, right behind the baby Richard's ear. "This little birthmark, in the shape of a star. Your grandfather had it, your father has it, and so do you. It's our seal, the proof of our blood." A chill ran down Richard's spine. He had never paid any attention to that small mark, an insignificant detail on his skin. But suddenly, his mother's words echoed in his mind with terrifying weight. The proof of our blood. As Richard was haunted by this revelation in his cold mansion, miles away, the true proof of blood was about to enter the world. Isabella's pregnancy came to an end. The pains began on a rainy dawn, a grim echo of the night it all began. Alone, she took a taxi to the nearest public hospital, holding her belly and whispering words of encouragement to her unborn child. The labor was a lonely battle, a test of physical and emotional endurance. There was no hand to hold, no words of comfort from a partner. There was only her strength, and the life that was fighting to be born. After hours of agony, a strong, healthy cry cut through the silence of the delivery room. Isabella's son had been born. Exhausted and flooded with a love that healed all her wounds, she held him in her arms. And as she gently cleaned his little head, she noticed it, a small, perfect and unmistakable star-shaped mark right behind his ear, the Davenport mark. Isabella's water broke in the middle of a busy shift at the diner. Chaos was instantaneous, but Maria took control like a general, shouting orders, calling a cab and holding Isabella's hand with a force that kept her anchored to reality. The labor was long and brutal, a marathon of pain and fear that tested every limit of her strength. In those hours, alone in a public hospital in Brooklyn, she thought about giving up, about faltering. But then, she remembered the sound of that little heart on the ultrasound, the promise she had made to herself. She wasn't alone. With a final scream that tore through her throat and her soul, she brought her son into the world. The baby's cry, sharp and strong, filled the room, and it was the most beautiful sound Isabella had ever heard. When they placed him in her arms, small, wrinkled and perfect, the outside world disappeared. The hardship, the humiliation, the pain. Everything dissolved the moment her eyes met her son's. She named him Leo. And as she nestled him to her chest, she felt a peace that money could never buy. She was a fortress, and Leo was her world. Months later, Isabella's life found a new rhythm, exhausting and beautiful. The days were a collage of late-night feedings, diaper changes and work at the diner, where Maria now acted like a doting grandmother. On a sunny autumn afternoon, wanting to give Leo some fresh air, she decided to do something different. She took the subway to Central Park, a place she usually avoided as it was a reminder of the world that had discarded her. With Leo in a stroller, she walked aimlessly, enjoying the sun on her face, when a loud cry from the baby made her stop. He had dropped his only pacifier. Isabella bent down to look for it but couldn't find it. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. "Looking for this?" a familiar, cold and controlled voice asked. Her heart froze. It was Richard. He was there, just a few feet away, impeccable as ever, holding the pacifier between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a dirty object. The universe, with its cruel irony, had decided that their reunion would be there, in the heart of the city that had united and separated them. Richard's gaze was one of pure contempt. He opened his mouth to say something cutting, something about how she shouldn't frequent this place, but the words died before they were born. His eyes were drawn like a magnet to the baby in the stroller. Denial was his first defense. It was just a baby. It could be anyone's child. But then Leo, bothered by the sun, turned his head to the side, exposing the soft skin behind his small ear, and Richard saw it. It wasn't a blemish, it wasn't a mole, it was a small star, sharp, perfect, identical to his, the Davenport mark, the proof of our blood. His mother's words echoed in his head with the force of a tidal wave. Reality hit him not like a wave, but like a concrete fist to the face. The air fled from his lungs. The sounds of the park, the laughter, the barking dogs, all turned into a deafening buzz. This wasn't a scam. This wasn't a lie. This was his son. The house of cards that was Richard's life collapsed in an instant. Every lie he had told himself, every insult he had hurled at Isabella, every night he had tried to drown her memory in whiskey, it all came back to haunt him. He looked at Isabella, but for the first time he truly saw her. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also a strength he had never possessed. He saw her hands, calloused from work, holding the stroller with a protective love that was fierce and unshakable. He had called her an opportunist, but it was he who had tried to buy a life with money. He had called her weak, but she had faced the world alone to protect their son. Shame consumed him, hot and suffocating. He, Richard Davenport, the master of the universe, was the poorest of men because he had thrown away the only treasure that truly mattered. "Richard," Isabella's voice brought him back, not with anger, just weariness. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What could he say? Sorry? The word was an offense, a tasteless joke in the face of the mountain of his cruelty. His eyes filled with tears, something that hadn't happened since he was a boy. Seeing the silent collapse of the man who had destroyed her, Isabella understood that the war was over. She didn't need his confession. The proof was there, in his eyes. Without a word, she took the pacifier from his trembling hand, put it in Leo's mouth, and with a regal dignity pushed the stroller and walked away. She left him there, alone in the middle of Central Park, a pathetic king in his kingdom of regret. Richard stood still, unable to move, as the woman he had denied and the son he had abandoned disappeared into the crowd. In that moment, he made a decision. It was no longer about denying or admitting. It was about deserving. He didn't know how, he didn't know if it was possible, but he would spend the rest of his life trying to redeem himself and fight, not for his empire, but for the right to one day be called father by the heir he had denied. If Isabella and Richard's journey of struggle and redemption has touched your heart, don't keep this emotion to yourself. Leave a like so this story can reach more people, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming narratives. And we want to know, what city are you watching from? Comment down below. Your interaction is our greatest strength. Explore our other videos and dive into more emotional stories like this one.